What if your inclusion strategy could actually drive revenue, retention, and innovation? Today, we're breaking down how to turn inclusion into a real business advantage. Let's grow.
According to Accenture, exclusion is costing U.S. companies collectively north of $1 trillion. You can have an organization that's celebrating a History Month for women who's also paying women 80 cents to the dollar of what they're paying a man to do the same job, right? Inclusion, DEI, and these practices, they do not belong in HR. When they're stuck inside HR, they tend to be used only for compliance purposes and for optics. Let's stop trying desperately to look good at doing this. And let's be honest about where we are, and from there we can move forward.
All right, today's guest is Joe Santana, an executive advisor and inclusion strategist. You've probably read his articles in multiple magazines. He's helping business leaders transform inclusion from an HR-driven exercise into compliance and optics for a true business center of excellence. We're going to dive into what that even means. So welcome so much, Joe.
Hey, it's a pleasure being here with you, Chelsey.
It's a hot topic. Let's just dive right in. What are most corporate leaders just getting wrong about inclusion efforts today?
Well, you know what? If you think back as to how these efforts started, that gives you a sense of, where they are today and how they got to where they are today. So back in the 1960s, when a lot of new laws were coming in about equality and equal employment, a lot of the work had to do with being fair in terms of hiring and showing an effort to make other people that were coming into the organization now from these groups that formerly were not part of the organization's workforce feel welcome and supported. And so a lot of that work turned into the organization running, let's say, history months and doing things just to make people feel more comfortable. But fundamentally, the actual organization wasn't changing very much, right? So to give you a classic example, you can have an organization that's celebrating a history month for women who's also paying women 80 cents to the dollar of what they're paying a man to do the same job, right? So you had a lot of that optical and performative effort being made in order to make people feel welcomed in the organization. But what wasn't happening was the organization wasn't actually changing what it had been doing for whatever number of decades. So that's one thing that was actually not producing the kind of results that companies might have wanted. And the other is that at the same time, these efforts weren't really being tied to ways of actually making the business more effective and making the business more profitable. So, for example, if you've got costs that the organization is paying because, let's say, sticking with our example, women are leaving faster than men, maybe because they're unhappy with the fact that they're getting paid 80 cents to the dollar for what a man is getting paid to do the same job. And you're celebrating history months. Well, that's not addressing the real problem, which is the inequality in the pay. And so it's not addressing also that turnover, and turnover translates into cost. And in a large organization, a couple of points of extra turnover from, let's say, just women and a couple of demographics can translate into millions of dollars.
Big bucks. So it's not just about
Big
being
bucks.
nice.
Right.
If most corporate DI efforts are still kind of in this HR or legal bucket, are they doing more harm than good? Are they distracting from the real value of inclusion?
That's a great question. I don't think that harm as much as they are not really addressing some of the core issues that need to be addressed. So according to Accenture, exclusion is costing U.S. companies collectively north of $1 trillion. Now, that number grew during a time when we were doing all these different things. So clearly, a lot of the efforts were not addressing underlying issues and challenges, like the aforementioned one with women getting paid less than men, even though the company is celebrating, various types of history months. And so you end up with a situation where these efforts are meant to make people feel like they're really included and belong in the organization, but they're not addressing underlying issues. So what I would say is that it's basically putting veneer on furniture rather than actually, rebuilding it and making it stronger and better. So not hurting, but not helping. And not all organizations did that. I mean, there have been a few organizations that actually did have quite a lot of success, even in the last couple of decades, in terms of creating business impact through these efforts. But unfortunately, they're the exception and not the rule.
I know this might be very basic, but can we start with you mentioned exclusion is costing the US X amount of dollars. What's exclusion? What is inclusion?
So inclusion, interesting question again, because it could be defined in different ways by different people. And the reason for that is that I was just talking to someone about this the other day. DEI, in many cases, the definitions of what these different things mean have been driven by organizations. In other words, organizations say, well, inclusion for us means et cetera, or equity for us means et cetera. So as a result of that, you have all these different competing definitions. But for me, if I'm answering that question, for me, inclusion is where you have an environment where every person who works for your organization is being supported in a way that enables them to perform at their very best. And this is, of course, beneficial to the person as well as beneficial to the organization. So I'll give you a quick example of what I mean by that. Suppose you have an organization that has a sales force that's comprised half of people who have child care responsibility and another half that do not. And traditionally, let's face it, even today, a lot of child care responsibilities fall on women, right? So let's say that's your sales force. And suppose you have a reimbursement policy in the organization that, let's say, for example, if I go out for a drink with a potential client and have dinner with them, I can go back and I can get a complete reimbursement for all my expenses connected with that particular event. However, if someone else who has a childcare responsibility also incurs, let's say, a babysitting fee for a toddler because their daycare center is not open during the hours that they're going to take this client out, in a lot of organizations, they can't get that reimbursed. So what does that mean? That means that in a sales force made up of people who have and don't have these responsibilities, the people who don't are clearly advantaged in terms of not suffering any hardship in pursuing a new client over the people that do have those responsibilities. To me, that's not an inclusive practice because you're literally not equally supporting all your workers in order for them to be as effective as possible. You're creating a situation where some workers are better supported than others. And primarily, why are we doing that? Because a lot of the rules and policies that organizations have today were developed years ago during the Leave It to Beaver era when it was, dad, went to work and mom stayed at home with the kids, right? And yet those conditions don't exist anymore. And yet the underlying practices and policies are still the same. And one more example very quickly is a lot of the practices and policies that we have around days off. In most organizations today, if you happen to be of any Christian denomination, you can take off, let's say, Good Friday or these other Christian holidays. And then you have, of course, your PTO package that you can use for vacations and other things like that. If you happen to belong to any non-Christian faith, very likely, if you want to celebrate a holiday, you've got to dig into your PTO bucket because it's not covered separately. So in that organization, the holiday structure is set up, or the time off structure, especially relative to religion, is set up under the assumption that we're still living back in the 90s or 60s when the majority of the workforce was Christian. But that's not the case anymore. So to me, inclusion is the systemic change of parts of the organization and policies and practices in order to provide equal support to all the people that are working in that organization. It's about building a true house for the workforce that we have today, instead of what I call trying to shove elephants into a house that was built for a giraffe.
Those are great examples. And we've all been in the room where something like that has happened, where or a holiday isn't celebrated that is like, I'll share a personal story. I worked at one company where every federal holiday was recognized except for two, MLK Day and Juneteenth. And I went to the head of HR in the C-suite and said, "Guys," because it was guys, "what are we doing here? Like this, you realize this is not okay. It's not a choice, first of all, and like, what is this?" So I left before they made their decision to change it. There you go. Um, but how can a company who maybe is putting a little lip service or putting a veneer on their efforts to be an inclusive workforce, how can they start to make changes where it's driving at the root cause?
I think it all starts with motivation and awareness of what the cost is of not doing anything. A lot of times, in a lot of organizations, when I talk to them about the cost of exclusion, the cost of doing nothing, the initial reaction is that, it's kind of a surprise. Because remember that $1 trillion that I was talking about? It's distributed in a couple of $1 million here and there in each one of these different organizations. Organizations sometimes don't see that. So a lot of times it starts with making them aware of that. So one of the ways that I do it when I'm having conversations with them, and one of the ways that I encourage people that are in these organizations driving these efforts to do it, is I'll look at things like, for example, let's say turnover. So I'll look at the turnover rate that they have in their organization. And then I look at the turnover rate for their industry and I compare the two. And if the turnover rate for their industry is lower than their turnover rate, then the next thing to do is to go deeper and say, well, where is this excess turnover, which is a cost? Where's that coming from? Is it women leaving faster than men? Is it African Americans leaving faster than whites? What's driving it? Once you know what's driving it, once you know what particular demographic, now you can dig a little deeper, sit down with people and say, okay, great. Listen, we love having everybody, engage and do their best in the organization. And we'd love to know, what is it that makes you stay? And what is it that you think can be better? Or what are some of the things that maybe you think don't support you as effectively? And through that kind of dialogue, you find out sometimes that it could be something very minimal. Like, for example, women might be leaving the company faster than men, especially when they reach that age when they feel like they're either going to have a kid now or it's now or never. It could be because the organization doesn't have an easy, frictionless way of them leaving the organization and then coming back after maternity leave. Well, that multiplied in an organization that has, 30,000 employees or so could be a big multi-million dollar expense in losing talent, replacing people, et cetera. And if you go to finance, you can quantify these numbers for that organization. So you can come back and you could say, listen, you've got a $20 million profit hole because women are leaving faster, and here's why. And then at that point, you can also present solutions. And the reason is because, they don't have a frictionless exit and return from maternity leave. And for like $100,000, you could put a program together that does that. You could put a program together that creates an ease of transfer of responsibility, creates an ease of return with mentors and so forth, so that the person picks up speed, because in today's world, you're gone for a couple of weeks and the whole organization changes. So you need someone to help you kind of ease back into that. But now, I mean, the ROI is obvious and astronomical. You're talking about, give me $100,000 to put in a small program, and I'm going to give you back 20 million that you're bleeding as a result of losing people. So when you present it that way, they get it. Sometimes they don't even think of that as being inclusion or DEI, even though it is, but they
Mhm.
think of it as, oh, that's an interesting, because you're talking now about resolving a business problem. A couple of years ago, I faced something like that many, many years when I actually was working in a corporate organization. I used to run an outsourcing department. So I actually came into the DEI space from the business end. I didn't come in as an HR person. And when I was running that outsourcing department, one of the challenges that we had was that we were honing and tuning our selling process, but we were not actually keeping up in our ability to deliver. And what I mean by that is in the outsourcing business, when you secure a new piece of business, you now have to take a leader from inside your organization and drop them into that company to act as your point of contact and to act as the person who's going to coordinate all those services. And so your ability to begin to realize revenue and to deliver has a lot to do with how many people do you have in that bench and how quickly can you deploy from the time the contract is signed to have somebody in there to begin to deliver those services. And that's where we were weak. That's where my particular team, we had about 300 people in the team. That's where we were struggling. And one of the things I noticed was we had men, only men, like you said before, the guys, right?
Yeah.
That were sitting on that bench. And I wondered why, because the organization had a lot of women that were pretty smart too. And I wondered why we only had men on that team. So I started sleuthing around a little bit. And what I found out was that people come into the organization one or two ways. They came in through the technical side, and that's where most of the men came in, or they came in through the logistics side, and that's where most of the females came in. So a lot of the female professionals worked on the help desk. They worked
Hmm.
in logistics to acquire parts or software, whereas a lot of the men either physically fixed the machines or they were the programmers. And the training program for leadership literally was a program that introduced men that showed that they were, aggressively moving very quickly up through the organization, introduced them to what was happening on the logistics side to give them a holistic view of the company, and then slotted them in for other experiences and training that led to them being prepared to sit on that bench and be ready for the next leadership assignment. Women, on the other hand, who came into the logistics side, did not get a corresponding window into what the technicians were doing. And they didn't need to become technicians just to understand it, just like they didn't need to become experts in logistics just to understand it. All we did, and by we, I mean myself and another team that I got, some HR people and trainers and others, was create a small program that added to the management training program, a module where people who came from the logistics side became aware of what was going on the technical side by shadowing, by job shadowing. And as a result of that, more women started showing up in that leadership bench. We started closing accounts faster because the leadership bench was now bigger. So we had more people to deploy. And the result was a 17% increase in revenue for the company, which translated into millions, right? Once you start making those connections and showing how these different things, like, for example, removing an obstacle from a demographic of people, in this case, women, how that impacts profitability and so forth, you begin to get the attention of leadership. And they begin to see that this is not just something that they should, relegate to the HR department to run as a small compliance and optics program.
If you had 5 minutes with a skeptical CEO who's like, it's just, we don't need it. What kind of numbers would you talk about or what would you show them to prove this is a real profit and innovation driver?
Well, the first thing that I would do is hopefully this is a company either in the private sector or in the public sector who has numbers that are out there, because that's one of the things that I found that's really fascinating is that the amount of information that's available today about any given company out there in just the cloud, as it were, is absolutely amazing. So if you're a public company, obviously you have to put in SEC reports and you have to do all that stuff. Industry data about industry standards, that's all out there. So one of the things that I do before I go to a meeting like that is I would go out and I research the company. I find out what their revenue is, how many employees they have, what their revenue per employee is. So I just take the number of employees and divide it by the number of revenue. And then I look at their competitors and what their numbers are in those same categories. I also look up information on Glassdoor about what employees are saying about the company. And so I pull in a lot of data. And before I have that meeting, I basically just send that data ahead. And then, so I want to ground the conversation in reality and in
Hmm.
numbers, right? And, sometimes I'm going to get someone who's going to turn around and say, well, the people that go to Glassdoor tend to be disgruntled. And I don't argue that. Although there are some people that go there who are pretty positive about their organizations. But on the other side of the argument, the majority of the people who answer internal surveys do not file their complaints truthfully because they know that despite all the claims that this is anonymous, believe me, if you say something negative about your company, they'll find you. They'll trace you back through that survey. They'll know it was you. They'll know it was Chelsey Reynolds who said this, right? So they're able to, like, the people don't trust those. So clearly you're going to get a positive skew in your internal stuff, and might get a negative skew on your external, which means you have to triangulate and say the truth is probably in the middle. But to me, those complaints that people are giving, the reason why they leave, the reason why all these things, that is a gift because that tells you where you can strengthen your organization. You can't argue against the numbers side. If you're running an insurance company and you have 10,000 employees, and you're let's say making $10 billion, that's great. But if your competitor in the same space is making $20 billion, then you have to ask yourself, why is it that they in the same space are more efficient and producing more than we are? And there could be a number of structural reasons, but one of those reasons usually is the level of engagement or disengagement of employees. Now, your HR people can turn around and say, well, our surveys show that our employees are very engaged. And my response is they might be very engaged, but they're certainly not very productive, right? Right. So the point is that I like to ground everything in numbers. I like to ground everything in a picture of the organization. And even if this person doesn't completely, let's say, for example, they look at these numbers and they go, well, these are publicly available numbers, but we have other internal numbers. Then, what I invite them to do is really very simple. I'll give you my data set. You go in your company, give it to your finance people and to your data analytics and have them adjust the numbers up or down and see if you like the picture. See if you like the picture. If you like the picture, then I'm not going to argue with you. Change nothing. But if you don't like the picture and you want to make it better and you think that your investors and shareholders would like to see a better picture, then the choice is clear.
How can leaders start thinking differently about the structure of where it fits, what it means, this whole inclusion thing in their organization?
Well, I'll tell you right now, I have a pretty strong bias in that area that I'll share with you. I think that inclusion, DEI, and these practices, they do not belong in HR. And the reason why is because when they're stuck inside HR, they tend to be used only for compliance purposes and for optics. They become employer branding and all the other stuff we talked about before. I think that these practices are best leverage when they sit outside as a center of excellence. So when they're outside of the HR silo and they're sitting as a center of excellence, then they can work with sales on improving how, let's say, sales connects with certain markets. They can work with product part of the organization on how do you make products that are more appealing to a broader modern marketplace. They can work with all parts of the organizations in ways that really impact the bottom line. In fact, in a lot of the articles that I write and a lot of the studies that I've done, where I've actually seen these practices have a really strong impact, it was never from within HR. It was always because they partnered with another part of the organization, whether it be sales, marketing, supply chain, some other part of the organization. So rather than having it stuck in any particular silo, I advocate have it as a center of excellence. Give it a budget that enables it to run, let's say, for example, its general expenses, salaries, office space, etc., and then fund everything else on a project by project basis. So let's say, for example, I'm running this department and I talk to you and you're the head of sales. And we talk about by making your approach, we can make you more inclusive and make you be able to seize a bigger market, right? And then we do the numbers and we realize that, wow, there's probably 10, 20 million, 30 million, maybe more that you can seize as a result of this. Now we can go back together and we could say, okay, we need to appropriate funds for this and what it's going to cost to do something like that. We might be talking about $1 million or $250,000, but we're asking for an investment to produce a result. not just money, so that we could do activity. And I think that's the best way to run it.
I mean, when I'm putting together ad campaigns, we start with a little ad campaign and then we see which ones work. And then we say, all right, let's pour some gas on this one. Every dollar we spend is getting us $5. Why wouldn't you just keep putting a dollar in? It makes no sense. So you're just breaking it down. It's a business decision, guys.
It's all it is. That's all it is, Chelsey. It's a business decision. It is you know, I'm not just saying blindly, hey, give me $10,000 and I'm going to run a bunch of, like celebration dates and so forth. And, according to Name the Think Tank, these are really good for the organization, et cetera. And it all sounds like blah, blah, right? Instead, what I'm saying is, hey, give me 50 grand to put this program together and I'm going to speed up the rate at which you close business to the tune of an extra $8 million a year, or give me $100,000 and I'm going to close a gap that's now bleeding you for $10 million a year. And so again, you're asking for investments, and upfront, you're asking for that investment with a clear ROI. And then later on, you're going to report on, where did you land? Did you come close to it? Did you meet it? Did you surpass it? And then from there, you decide what your next investment is going to be. That's how all businesses run. This should be no different.
For companies who don't have a chief diversity officer or inclusion officer, and this is just something that they check off, HR checks off to do, should they think about sending somebody to a course or bringing somebody in so that when they start doing inclusion exercises, it's not veneer and it's done properly?
Yes, the answer to that is that they should seek to either A, get someone properly trained, B, hire someone, or C, if it's a small company and they can't hire someone, probably, get fractional attention from someone who is a consultant who has a proven track record in doing this in a way that produces business results. It's important to organizations at all sizes, just the amount of money that you're either, that it's costing you or that you can save or grow. It's a relative function of how big your company is, but it affects all organizations. So my answer is yes, you should get someone there that understands basically demographics, how the world is changing, how that affects your particular business. They should, if they don't understand your business, really understand your business and how you measure results within your business. Because that's another thing. If you have somebody in there who's an expert in running DEI programs, but they're totally divorced from understanding how your business works, then you end up with the veneer again, because you end up with programs and processes that you can't actually see on your spreadsheets or on the bottom line. So you want somebody who has a combination of those skills, who both understands the inclusion space, but also understands your business space and is able to speak business language instead of what I call duck speak or HR speak.
And you have tons of resources we'll link below. Someone can watch this episode or listen to this episode and then go there to get started and then figure out what the next steps are.
Sure.
Today
Absolutely.
is a very gloomy, doomy DEI environment from where I sit in terms of, it's the devil. So there are some great stories I'm sure that you have where inclusions fueled innovation or helped with profitability. Why aren't companies shouting these out from the rooftops instead of just hiding and keeping it quiet?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that there are companies that do shout it, but it's, if this was an audience of 10,000 people, there might be 6 of them, right? So their voices get drowned out. And all you hear is all the other noise. A lot of organizations for many years, I don't have an exact number. This is just, at this point, it's just my sense looking at literature and looking at what I've seen around me. A lot of organizations for many years did a lot of things that were, again, they were for compliance purposes and they were for optic purposes. And even the compliance, if you read between the lines in compliance, like, for example, take your affirmative action reports and so forth, all it requires is that you show a good faith effort. What does that mean? That means you don't have to succeed. You just have to prove you're trying, right? So a lot of these efforts are designed to show, hey, we're trying. Look, we're a good company and we're fair. A lot of training programs were designed so that, let's say, Chelsey, you and I work in a company together and we took the training. And if anything goes wrong, it's like, you get the legal statement. We at the company do not support this behavior. Joe and Chelsey are bad. right? Right. And they took the training, and here's their signature to show that we, as a responsible organization, made sure they knew between right and so these training programs were not done to change behavior as much as they were done to protect against any kind of future litigation or problems and things like that. And so because so many organizations were doing these different things, that's what you heard. And there was a whole industry. I just was working on an article on that. I mean, there was an industry that was almost $8 billion that was built around supporting this, giving awards to organizations because they wrote a nice PR script about what they were doing and how wonderful they were, right? Or even various consulting organizations that supported organizations by providing that type of training so they could check the box and say, we did the obligatory DEI training, so now we're good in case anything goes wrong. So there was a whole industry built around this. That industry was projected, by the way, by now to grow almost to $25 billion, I think, between now and 2030. That didn't happen, obviously, because of the backlash. A lot of these organizations found that they lost a lot of business. But I say all this to just say that there was a lot of activity and a lot of noise around these different things that were happening that were mostly performative. And so that's the most prominent thing. And a lot of these organizations, the leader of the organization, I guarantee you, in fact, that half of the people that signed those pledges, the CEO action pledges and whatever, had no idea of what these pledges were. Corporate communications put a statement together. HR put it in front of them. They looked at it. Legal said it was okay. They signed it. No clue as to what it means, but it's just a PR statement. So the organization looks good. So given that, as soon as they got a little pushback and they saw that, oh, wait a minute, like now people are saying they don't like this. So the government is saying that we might get in trouble if we do this. The easiest thing for them to do is say, well, then let's not do it anymore. I don't know why we were doing it before anyway. So, let's not do it anymore. And then, of course, later on, they found out, most famously, one of the big box stores found out why they shouldn't have just pulled the plug right away. But the thing is that, again, that's all the noise. And even the arguments that you hear today, if you listen to or read a lot of the magazines or the posts and the articles, a lot of them are between people talking about either A, we should continue doing what we were doing before because it works and we have to fight the backlash. Or B, we need to modify how we call things. Instead of using inclusion, use belonging. And we need to find other ways to put these practices into the company in such a way that they don't cause trouble for us legally or politically, but at the same time, keep employees happy and so forth. And my response to that is both those answers are wrong. And the reason why is because that's just a continuation of what they were doing before, except either doing it by a stealth or fighting it openly over here. What they really need to do is start doing things more and more like those few companies that are that handful in that big audience of 10,000 that actually produce results. Because there are organizations going back, even as far back as 15 and 20 years, that have been producing results. That's not new. What's been missing is it's not ubiquitous. What's ubiquitous is performance.
Did you have the post about rebranding DEI?
Yes.
Yeah. So when I read one of your posts that was like, DEI we need to rebrand this thing. Like, let's figure out that might just be one of the steps. It made me think of global warming. People were able to say, the planet's not getting warmer. It's normal. Look at the history. So it was just like, okay, the name, that's one step of it. But then how do you educate and show, all right, this is what actually is happening to the planet. It's facts. Here's what actually is happening to your company if you don't take inclusion seriously and you think it's just, something to make people feel good.
Yeah, yeah, no, great point. And I love something you said right now. So I'm gonna build on it a little bit, which is here's what's happening in your company. That's really critical. If you're gonna meet with a senior leader and you're gonna talk about this topic, instead of coming in and saying, well, McKinsey says that if you focus on this, you're gonna increase your revenue by 34%. Or this other group says that diverse teams actually produce more innovative ideas. Wonderful. Now prove how that's happening here, right? I mean, I come from a background as a line executive. Somebody came to me and said, listen, McKinsey says that if you invest $1 million in this particular product, that our business is going to grow. I would think they had lost their mind. I mean, it's like, that's not a business argument. You're pitching me on generalities and so forth. So my approach and my advice is use things like if McKinsey says, or if any think tank says, hey, organizations that have these practices reduce turnover, which saves them millions of dollars. Instead of going back to your organization and saying, here's the business case, instead, use that as your inspiration for going into the records and asking, okay, how is that operating here? How is that showing up in our organization? Are we actually seeing a big loss as a result of higher turnover? Is that turnover localized to any particular pockets, that excess turnover? What can we do to address that and so forth? And then go back to business leadership and say, hey, I read this. It got me to thinking. I investigated our records. Here's what I found. Here's what it's costing us. Here's what we need to do to fix it. How much that'll cost. Here's the ROI. That last piece, or those last couple of steps, are the steps that are usually missing. And I don't know if it's people are overwhelmed and they don't have the time to do the research, or they just don't know how to do it. But that's really important to do that. You want to go into an organization and say, this is what's happening here, and this is what we can do specifically for you. This is what it's going to cost you. This is what it's going to bring you specifically. That's a business case. Anything short of that is not a business case.
I'm just thinking if you're thinking about this, just hire outside help to come in and help you. Just have fresh eyes on this, guys. If tomorrow your CEO or someone's CEO told you, "Hey, let's cut everything that doesn't drive a measurable business outcome. Cut it." What current inclusion practices would you actually kill? Like kill this instantly, and what would you replace them with so that you can build this what you called true center of excellence?
I mean, if I were told that I had to kill stuff that did not have a direct impact on the organization. I mean, some of the performative stuff, like all those icons all over the websites and stuff like that. Maybe the word kill is not the appropriate word, but I would modify things like Women's History Month celebration. One of the things that I used to really push for was if you're going to have a celebration like that, and you're going to talk about what you achieve, that's wonderful. If you have something to talk about that you've actually achieved, but then also address the elephant in the room. Like, for example, hey, here's what we've done that's really great, but here are some areas where we have room for improvement that we're focusing on, because otherwise it comes across as gaslighting. I remember an example. I'll give you a quick example. A couple of years ago, organization I was with, and this woman came up. It was a Women's History Month, and was talking about all the success she had, and the unspoken but communicated message was, if I can do it, so can you, right? But here was the difference. This woman came from a very wealthy family. Her husband was extremely wealthy as well. In fact, I think he was a board member of the company. And she had access to all kinds of resources. Like the average woman that was sitting in that audience did not have an au pair living with them,
Yeah.
helping them with their children. The average woman sitting in that audience did not have so many connections to the governing board of the organization through their spouse or to someone else. So to present yourself as the ideal, or to present yourself as a model for, if I can do it, you can too, in that particular instance, it's disingenuous, right? So I always wanted more reality in those. But that would be something. The other thing is, awards for activity without being able to show results. That would be another one. That's empty too. I did have an experience not long ago where I asked people to put down the business impact of what they did as part of judging their performance. And a lot of them, I mean, whatever was written, it looked like it was written by somebody who was well schooled in PR, but not in finance, because it had a lot of words and it had a lot of nice stories, but there were no numbers there, and I kept sending it back. I think stuff like that is the kind of stuff. I'll tell you this. If you are in an organization where you begin to actually drive business impact, then to your point before about marketing and doubling down on what works, your discussion doesn't become one of what to cut. Your discussion becomes one of what should we invest, and how much we should invest has a lot to do with what's going to be the return on that investment. And of course, the decision that a senior leader has to make, is essentially, if I've got different things that are clamoring for dollars, I've got a finite amount of money that I can dole out. And this thing is going to give me 50% ROI. This is going to give me 2x, 3x, 4x, 5x, 6x. And I can only invest in 3 of them. I'm going to pick the top 3, right? So it becomes a question of investment and what's going to yield the highest return on investment, as opposed to cutting, because even some of those things that are visual, they have their value. It's just that when you do only that, it doesn't really get you there, right? It
Mhm.
does not really get you there in terms of addressing some of the needs of the organization. If I put it to a vote, though, and I have put it to a vote sometimes, and when I'm giving speeches, I ask, when I'm, have a big audience and I have a lot of women in the audience, I ask the ladies to vote. What would you rather have? Equal pay, right hand up, or bigger history months, left hand up? Right? I don't get a lot of left hands up. In fact, I don't get any.
No, keep paying me less, please. Oh my gosh.
Pay me
This
less
is
and let's celebrate.
Yeah, let's have a party. I really want pizza. So these could be sensitive topics, and then something that, I don't want to stumble and sound like a racist. I don't want to stumble and sound like a sexist or like I don't care. Is there a safe space or a safe way for a leader to fumble through the questions that they have?
Yeah, that's another interesting question. I think that unfortunately that fear prevents actual progress to some degree, because let's face it, people are going to stumble. Everybody does. Even people that are experts in this topic stumble. One of the things, a good friend of mine, who I won't name, but I'll tell his story. He is brilliant when it comes to unconscious bias. Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant man. And he was telling the story about how one time he was, driving his car, and he saw a group of youths, and they were black, and he was getting to a point where he was getting to a light, and it was dark, and he automatically hit the switch to close all the doors, right? And after he did it, he goes, the look that one of the kids gave him was kind of like, wow. And he realized, he was like, and then he went back and he's like, here I am. I teach this. I know it inside out. I'm still subject to it. And I make mistakes. And, you know, and I remember the experience that I had and that others had who worked a lot in this space. I know I did a lot of my own unconscious bias training, and I really delved into the topic for a while. And I used to tell people all the time, I said, the only thing that I learned as I study this topic more and more is how biased I am. I mean, it's like it's like a journey through, like, wow, I didn't think I thought like that, but I do. I obviously respond very quickly, and it happens even before I check myself, right? And so I say that because if we want to be able to effectively address some of the challenges and be able to grow, we have to be willing to create that space that you're talking about and to be willing to work with people that are as imperfect as we are. And essentially it's like, hey, you made a mistake, you acknowledge it, you're doing your best to correct it. You're working on you and I'm working on me, and let's move on together. I think, one of the fathers of diversity management was this fellow by the name of R. Roosevelt Thomas, and he wrote several books years ago, back in the 1990s, late 1990s. And he talked about the fact that managing effectively in a diverse environment had a lot to do with being able to manage the similarities, differences, and tensions that everybody brings into a group when they have a diverse group. So I'll give you an example really quickly of similarities, differences, and tensions. You could have a group of people where they're running a project and they just don't see the goal that they should be pursuing as the same. So now their differences are pulling in different directions. So that has to be mitigated, and that creates tension. Similarities also create tension because you could have two people in the group that think that they are the ones that should be leading this. And so now their desire to head it, to control it, and the belief that they can do the best by it, they're both sort of like these alpha people, and they're colliding with each other. That creates tension. So what Thomas was saying was that managing that tension of similarities and differences, that's what actually, and doing it in the way that produces positive results, that's actually how you get the most out of diverse teams. So in working with senior leaders or others, as we all try to navigate our way to becoming more effective in working in an increasingly diverse, increasingly global world with increasingly global marketplace, etc., the formula is we need to give each other space because there will be tension. There will be tension that results from similarities and differences, and we have to work through that. And if we just sort of cancel each other and say, well, I'm not going to deal with this person anymore because they did this and this is wrong, and I'm judge and jury, and boom, they're canceled. We're not going to get very far doing that.
This has been a really fun topic. Appreciate you coming on.
Hey, my pleasure. Had a lot of
I know
fun.
we're almost at time. We could keep going for like 2 hours. I've got so many questions.
Absolutely.
We're going to link. Joe has a podcast too. He has books. He has a whole website. So we're going to link to all that below. And before we wrap up, what's one bold move you wish more companies had the courage to make that you can challenge us with as we depart today?
I think one bold move that I think companies could take that would really put them on the right path is, let's stop trying desperately to look good at doing this. And let's be honest about where we are. And from there, we can move forward. Because if we're spending all that energy and that time and so forth, still trying to hold up the pretense, that's only robbing resources and attention from focusing on how to do things that actually produce results.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Joe. And I look forward to following your journey and keep learning from you.
Same here, Chelsey. Thank you so much for having me here today. I appreciate it.